I woke up that morning expecting a normal day, but the moment I opened my front door, I knew something was off. My driveway, my own property, was completely blocked, and not just by a random car or some construction cones. No, a massive yellow bulldozer was parked right there, sitting like a stubborn beast, cutting me off from the street. At first, I thought there had to be some mistake. Maybe the city was doing work, maybe a contractor had parked in the wrong spot. But as I got closer, I saw a bright red HOA violation notice taped right onto the machine. The note wasn't even official looking, just a piece of paper with rushed handwriting. Community Improvement Project. Do not move. HOA authorized equipment. My stomach dropped. The HOA. Again. These people had been a thorn in my side for months, handing out ridiculous fines, nitpicking about the smallest things. But this was next level insanity. How was blocking my driveway an improvement? And who the hell gave them the right to park heavy machinery on my property? Fuming, I grabbed my phone and marched straight to the HOA office. The second I walked in, I saw her, Mrs. Carter, the queen of pettiness herself, sitting behind her desk, shuffling through some papers like she didn't have a care in the world. I slammed the notice down in front of her. "What the hell is this?" I demanded. She barely looked up, just adjusted her glasses with that smug little smile I had come to despise. "Oh yes," she said, voice dripping with condescension. "We're expanding the community walking path. Your driveway is temporarily part of the project. You'll need to park elsewhere for the next few weeks." Weeks, not hours, not a day. Weeks. I felt my eye twitch. "You're kidding, right?" I asked, barely keeping my voice level. "This is my driveway, my private property." But Mrs. Carter just sighed like I was some unruly child throwing a tantrum. "It's for the benefit of the community," she said. "I suggest you cooperate. Fighting the HOA never ends well." There it was, the thinly veiled threat. I had seen them do it to other homeowners before, bully them into silence, slap them with fines, and make their lives miserable if they dared to fight back. But they had just made a huge mistake. I wasn't just going to let this slide. They wanted to play dirty? Fine. They had no idea who they were messing with. I stepped back outside, leaned against my car, and waited. Greg was still nearby, chatting with some other HOA cronies, completely unaware of what was about to go down. The moment the tow truck rolled up, his face twisted in confusion, then realization, then absolute panic. And that was the moment I knew. I had already won. I stood there, staring at the massive bulldozer blocking my driveway, my jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. This wasn't just petty. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a blatant power move, a calculated slap in the face by an HOA that thought they were untouchable. They expected me to roll over, to nod along and accept their ridiculous community improvement project excuse. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. I had seen them do this before. The HOA had a history of bullying homeowners into submission, handing out insane fines, enforcing rules that didn't exist until they decided to make them up. I had heard the horror stories from my neighbors, the family who got fined for leaving their garage door open for 10 minutes, the elderly couple forced to repaint their house 3 times because the shade of beige was too warm, the single mother who received a letter saying her front porch plants were too unruly, whatever that meant. And now it was my turn, only this time they had gone too far. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down, but my blood was boiling. My first instinct was to call the police, but I knew how that would go. The HOA had connections. They always did. I needed to be smart about this. I needed to play the long game. So instead of losing my temper, I did something they didn't expect. I smiled. The moment I turned around and walked away from the HOA office without another word, I could feel Mrs. Carter watching me, probably expecting me to come crawling back, begging for permission to use my own driveway. But she had no idea that I had already decided exactly how this was going to end, and it wasn't going to be in their favor. I spent the rest of the day doing my research. I went deep, pulled up every single legal document related to my property, read through every HOA regulation they had ever written, even the ridiculous ones. And then I found it. The loophole. The HOA's own rules stated that no vehicle, including construction equipment, could remain on a homeowner's property for more than 24 hours without explicit permission from the owner. And guess what? I hadn't given them permission. The next morning, I made my move. I called the tow company, not just any tow company, the biggest, meanest, most efficient heavy-duty towing service in town. These guys specialized in hauling 18-wheelers, buses, and, oh yeah, bulldozers. When the tow truck pulled up, the driver took one look at the situation and let out a low whistle. "Well, that's a first," he muttered, climbing out of his truck. "They really just parked this thing on your driveway?" I handed him the paperwork, the HOA's own rulebook with the relevant section highlighted. "It's been here for over 24 hours without my permission," I said, barely holding back my grin. "I'm having it towed." The driver grinned back. "You got it." Within minutes, he was setting up the rig, securing chains around the bulldozer's massive frame, and right as he started the lift, Mrs. Carter came running. I saw her from the corner of my eye, sprinting across the street in her perfect little business suit, her face twisted in a mask of rage and panic. "Stop!" she shrieked. "You can't do that!" I turned to her, holding up the HOA's own rulebook. "Actually, I can." She snatched it from my hands, eyes scanning the page. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But this is different. This is a community project. On my property," I said, crossing my arms. "And according to your rules, I get to decide what stays here. And I say it goes." The tow truck roared to life, the bulldozer slowly lifting off the ground. Mrs. Carter screeched something unintelligible, whipping out her phone and furiously typing. Probably calling the HOA board, maybe even the police. Too late. The tow truck driver gave me a thumbs up, then climbed into his rig and pulled out, taking the bulldozer with him. Just like that, my driveway was mine again. Mrs. Carter turned on me, her face red with fury. "You are in so much trouble," she spat. "The HOA will not stand for this." I shrugged. "Then I guess I'll see you at the next meeting." She stormed off, and for a moment, I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong, because that was when the fines started showing up. I thought getting the bulldozer towed would be the end of it. That maybe, just maybe, the HOA would get the message. That they'd realize I wasn't someone they could push around and finally back off. But I had underestimated just how vindictive these people could be. I should have known better. The moment Mrs. Carter stormed off that day, clutching the HOA rulebook like it was her personal Bible, I knew she wasn't going to let this slide. The first fine appeared in my mailbox the next morning. $250 for unauthorized removal of community property. I actually laughed when I read it. Community property? The HOA didn't even own that bulldozer. It was rented. They had no right to park it on my driveway in the first place, and now they were trying to fine me for removing something that never should have been there? I tossed the notice aside, knowing it was complete nonsense. But then the next one came, and the next, and the next. Day after day, new violations started piling up. $100 for an improperly maintained lawn, even though my grass was freshly cut. $500 for an unapproved modification to my property, which, as far as I could tell, meant my front porch light, which had been the same for years. $300 for excessive noise complaints, which was interesting considering I lived alone and barely made a sound. They were making things up, throwing everything they could at me, hoping I'd break under the pressure. But here's the thing, I don't break. I wasn't just going to sit back and let them drain my bank account with their fake violations. If they wanted a war, I was going to give them one. But I wasn't going to fight on their terms. No, I had something much better in mind. I started by documenting everything. Every notice, every fine, every ridiculous accusation. I took pictures of my lawn, my house, my driveway, anything they could possibly try to twist against me. I kept records of every conversation, every email, and then I went digging. I knew the HOA had to be hiding something. They always did. They acted like they were untouchable, but nobody is untouchable. I started talking to my neighbors, especially the ones who had been on the receiving end of the HOA's nonsense before, and that's when I hit the jackpot. Turns out, Mrs. Carter and her little circle of HOA board members had been pocketing HOA funds for years. A few of my neighbors had suspected it for a while, but no one had ever been able to prove it. The HOA collected thousands of dollars in dues from the homeowners every year, and yet, somehow, the community always seemed to be short on funds. Projects would start and mysteriously never get finished. Repairs would take forever, and when they were finally done, they looked like they had been completed by the cheapest contractor they could find. And the fines? Oh, those were a goldmine for the HOA. The more they fined people, the more money they had to mismanage. I spent weeks gathering evidence, old financial reports, emails, even meeting notes that hinted at budget adjustments that never quite made sense. But I needed more. I needed something solid. And then, like a gift from the universe, it landed right in my lap. One of my neighbors, an older gentleman named Frank, had actual receipts. Years ago, Frank had served as the HOA treasurer, back before Mrs. Carter and her crew took over. He had kept copies of old budgets, payments, and, most importantly, a record of a mystery expense that had drained nearly $50,000 from the HOA's funds. According to the records, the money was supposed to go toward a community beautification project. The problem? No such project had ever happened. The money had just vanished. And where did it go? Straight into a series of personal bank transfers labeled under names that just so happened to match Mrs. Carter and her friends. Bingo! Now, I could have gone straight to the police, could have marched right into the HOA meeting and thrown the evidence in their faces. But that would have been too easy, too fast. No, I wanted them to feel it. I wanted them to experience exactly what they had been doing to us for years. So I played along. I let the fines stack up, let them think they were winning. Every time a new violation arrived, I'd smile, nod, and act like I was completely helpless. Oh no, another fine? I guess I'll have to deal with it. I could see the smugness on Mrs. Carter's face every time we crossed paths. She thought she had me backed into a corner. She had no idea I was about to set the whole house on fire. Then, the perfect opportunity arrived. The HOA announced a mandatory community meeting. Attendance was required for all homeowners. And the topic? Upcoming fee increases. They were planning to raise dues again because of unexpected costs. I couldn't have asked for a better setup. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, packed with annoyed homeowners who were sick and tired of the HOA's constant money grabs. Mrs. Carter took her place at the front, all smiles, pretending like she wasn't about to screw over the entire neighborhood once again. And then, just as she started her speech about how these new fees were necessary for the good of the community, I stood up. Before we talk about new fees, I said, I think we should go over the current budget, just to make sure we understand where all our money is going. I swear I saw her eye twitch. That's not on the agenda, she said quickly. Oh, but it should be, I countered, pulling out a fat stack of papers. Because I've been doing a little research, and it turns out nearly $50,000 went missing from the HOA funds. And guess what? I have receipts. The room went silent. I started handing out copies of the records, bank transfers, emails, meeting notes that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Mrs. Carter and her little crew had been stealing from the community for years. People started whispering, flipping through the pages. The tension in the room exploded. And Mrs. Carter? She turned ghost white. She tried to cut me off, tried to claim the documents were out of context, but it was too late. The evidence was bulletproof. Homeowners started shouting, demanding answers, demanding refunds, demanding that the entire board step down immediately. It was chaos. Beautiful, satisfying chaos. And then someone called the cops. I don't know who did it, but I have a strong suspicion it was Frank. The police arrived, and once they took one look at the documents, it was over. Mrs. Carter and her corrupt board were removed on the spot. An investigation was launched. And guess what? They all ended up facing criminal charges. As for me, not only did the HOA drop every single fine they had slapped on me, but they were forced to pay back every homeowner they had ever scammed. I walked out of that meeting feeling lighter than I had in years. The HOA thought they could bully me, but they had no idea that I was 10 steps ahead. And the best part? My driveway stayed clear, forever. If the HOA thought their little power move with the bulldozer was going to scare me into submission, they had severely underestimated just how far I was willing to go to fight back. They had pushed too hard, crossed too many lines, and now they were about to learn a very painful lesson. Because here's the thing, when you try to bulldoze over someone's rights, you better be prepared for the rubble that follows. I had barely processed the shock of seeing a massive construction vehicle parked right in front of my house, completely blocking my driveway, when I knew this was no mistake. This was deliberate. A message. The HOA's way of flexing their control, as if to say, "See? We can do whatever we want." And oh, they tried to justify it. Mrs. Carter, the HOA president, actually had the nerve to claim that the bulldozer was there for neighborhood beautification, some vague excuse about sidewalk repairs and landscaping enhancements. But I knew better. The real reason? Pure spite. This was their revenge for all the times I had called them out, for not rolling over and accepting their nonsense. They wanted to make my life difficult, to force me into a corner where I had no choice but to comply. But instead of making me surrender, they just gave me ammo. I didn't react immediately. No angry calls, no yelling, no complaints. Instead, I started collecting evidence. I took pictures from every angle, showing the bulldozer parked directly across my driveway, blocking my car, preventing me from getting in or out. I took videos, narrating the situation, explaining how the HOA had done this without warning, without permission, without any legal right to do so. Then, I made my move. The first thing I did? Called the city. See, the HOA might think they're the ultimate authority in the neighborhood, but there are real laws that even they can't break. And one of those laws? You cannot obstruct private property. It doesn't matter if they claim it's for beautification or community improvements. Unless they had a permit, and I was willing to bet every dollar in my bank account that they didn't, this was illegal. I got on the phone with the local municipal office, explained the situation, and let's just say, the person on the other end of the line was not happy. Turns out, if you're going to park heavy machinery in a residential area, you need authorization from the city, and the HOA had none. But I wasn't done yet. The second thing I did? Called the tow company. Not just any tow company, one that specialized in heavy-duty removals. Because, funny enough, while the HOA might think they were immune to consequences, their precious bulldozer wasn't. And since it was illegally blocking my property, guess what? I had every right to have it removed. It didn't take long for the tow truck to arrive. And let me tell you, watching the HOA board members rush outside, eyes wide with panic as they realized what was happening, that was priceless. Mrs. Carter came stomping up to me, flanked by two of her cronies, her face already flushed red. "What do you think you're doing?" she screeched, as if I was the one causing the problem. "Oh, just exercising my rights as a homeowner," I said smoothly, handing her a copy of the city ordinance that clearly stated blocking a private driveway was a violation of municipal code. "Since you seem to have forgotten the law, I thought I'd help you out," she sputtered, trying to argue, but the tow truck driver wasn't interested in HOA politics. They had been called in for a job, and they were going to do it. So right in front of the entire neighborhood, right in front of every resident the HOA had been bullying for years, the tow truck operator hooked up the bulldozer and started hauling it away. But the best part? That wasn't even the worst of it for the HOA. Because while Mrs. Carter was busy screaming about how I was violating community rules, oh, the irony, a second city vehicle pulled up. Code enforcement. You see, when I had reported the illegal obstruction to the city, they decided to take a little extra interest in the situation. And after taking one look at what was happening, they weren't just interested in the bulldozer. They started asking questions. Hard questions. Questions about permits, about funding, about why the HOA thought they could block a private driveway with no legal grounds. And when the city started digging, what they found was a disaster for the HOA. Turns out, not only had they parked the bulldozer illegally, but they had also been operating without the necessary permits for multiple past projects. The sidewalk beautification plan? Unauthorized. The recent increase in HOA fees to cover maintenance costs? A lie. The entire operation was built on half-truths, shady deals, and blatant rule-breaking. The fines started piling up. Violations for improper use of funds, citations for failing to obtain permits, warnings for mismanagement and financial discrepancies. And when the city threatened to launch a full-scale audit of the HOA's finances, Mrs. Carter cracked. Suddenly, she wasn't the smug, power-hungry dictator of the neighborhood anymore. Suddenly, she was desperate. She tried to backpedal, tried to convince the city officials that it was all a misunderstanding, that the HOA was just looking out for the community. But it was too late. By the time the city was done, the HOA was facing thousands of dollars in fines. Their reputation? Shattered. Their control? Crumbling. And as for me, I never had to deal with their nonsense again. The HOA lost so much credibility over that incident that the entire board was forced to resign. New leadership took over, people who actually cared about the community instead of using it as their personal kingdom. And Mrs. Carter? Last I heard, she was dealing with legal troubles of her own. All because she thought a bulldozer was a smart way to get back at me. Turns out, the only thing that got bulldozed in the end was her reign of terror. You'd think after the bulldozer fiasco, the HOA would have learned their lesson, that they would have taken their punishment, paid their fines, and quietly backed off. But no, they doubled down. Instead of accepting defeat, they tried to retaliate. It was almost impressive, really, how far their arrogance could stretch, even when the entire neighborhood had turned against them. But what they didn't realize was that this time, they weren't just up against me, they were up against the law. The fallout from their stunt was bad enough. The illegal obstruction of my driveway had cost them thousands in fines, exposed their shady financial practices, and turned Mrs. Carter, the power-hungry HOA president, into the most hated person in the neighborhood. People were furious. Homeowners started demanding audits, questioning where their money had gone, and even threatening to file lawsuits for all the ridiculous fees and violations the HOA had imposed over the years. Their grip on the community was slipping, and yet, they still thought they could win. Instead of laying low, Mrs. Carter and her inner circle started spreading lies about me. Suddenly, I was the villain, the disruptive homeowner who had caused trouble and put the entire community at risk. They went door to door, trying to convince people that my actions had led to the city imposing stricter regulations on the neighborhood. They even had the audacity to threaten other homeowners with higher fines and penalties if they didn't support the HOA's cause. But here's where things got interesting. See, the HOA had gotten away with a lot over the years, but that was only because people had been too afraid to fight back. The moment they saw me standing up to them and actually winning, they realized something. The HOA wasn't as powerful as they pretended to be, and once people figured that out, everything changed. Homeowners started digging through their own records, uncovering years of suspicious fees, false violations, and outright fraud. Some people found they had been overcharged for community repairs that never happened. Others discovered they had been billed for fines they had never even been informed about. The HOA had been scamming the entire neighborhood for years. And when the truth finally came out, it was game over. One homeowner, a retired lawyer, took it upon himself to start gathering evidence. He reached out to the city, requested public records, and exposed even more dirt on the HOA's finances. Turns out, Mrs. Carter and her cronies had been misappropriating funds for a long time, using HOA money to pay for personal expenses, like expensive dinners, vacations, and even home renovations. The neighborhood erupted. People who had once been too scared to question the HOA were now calling for a full-blown investigation. A petition was started to remove the entire board. The city, already fed up with the HOA's nonsense, launched a formal inquiry. The local news even got involved, running a story about the corrupt HOA that had tried to bully a homeowner and ended up exposing itself instead. And then came the final nail in the coffin. The city's investigation revealed something huge, something that couldn't be ignored. Not only had the HOA been stealing money, but they had also been falsifying records to cover up their tracks, faking votes, forging signatures, even creating fake maintenance reports to justify where the money had gone. That was criminal. Mrs. Carter and her top board members weren't just facing removal from the HOA anymore. They were now facing criminal charges. And just like that, the arrogant, untouchable HOA that had ruled over the neighborhood with an iron fist was completely destroyed. Mrs. Carter was forced to resign in disgrace. The remaining board members were investigated for fraud. The HOA itself was dissolved, replaced by a new committee made up of actual homeowners who wanted to do right by the community. And as for me, I got exactly what I wanted. My driveway was finally my own again. No more bulldozers, no more threats, no more nonsense. And the best part? I never had to deal with the HOA's arrogance again. I thought the worst was over. I thought that after their bulldozer stunt, their lies, and their failed retaliation, the HOA would finally back off. Maybe they'd lick their wounds, try to rebuild their reputation, or, at the very least, leave me alone. But I underestimated their pettiness. Because instead of stopping, instead of taking the L and moving on, the HOA did something so outrageous, so unbelievably desperate, that it made everything they had done before seem like child's play. They went after my home. It started subtly, almost like they were testing the waters. Random letters in the mail, claiming I had violated some obscure rule. My trash cans were too visible from the street. My lawn was not uniform with the rest of the neighborhood. They even had the audacity to say that my front door color wasn't HOA approved, despite the fact that it was the exact same shade it had been for years. At first, I ignored it. I knew what they were trying to do. They were looking for any excuse to make my life difficult, hoping I'd get fed up and leave. But I wasn't going anywhere. And when ignoring them didn't work, they escalated. One day, I came home to find a bright red notice of violation stuck to my front door. This time, it wasn't about some petty nonsense like my trash cans. This time, they claimed I had made unauthorized modifications to my property, specifically the fence in my backyard. My fence. The one that had been there since before I even moved in. I knew right away this was pure retaliation. There was no way they could justify this violation. It was bogus, a pathetic attempt to harass me into submission. And when I refused to comply, they hit me with fines. Hundreds of dollars in fines. Every week, a new one arrived, each one more ridiculous than the last. Suddenly, my mailbox was too tall. My car was parked incorrectly in my own driveway. They even had the nerve to say my Christmas lights had been up too long after the holidays, even though half the neighborhood still had decorations up. And just when I thought they couldn't sink any lower, they did. One morning, I woke up to a letter that made my blood boil. The HOA had filed a lien against my house. That's right, a lien. They were trying to steal my home. See, HOA bylaws often have clauses that allow them to place a lien on a homeowner's property if they fail to pay fines. And if those fines go unpaid for too long, they can initiate foreclosure. That was their end game. They wanted me gone. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just about my driveway anymore. This was about power, about control, about a corrupt, arrogant HOA that thought they could bully homeowners into submission. They picked the wrong person to mess with. So I did what they never expected. I fought back. And I wasn't alone. Because by now, the entire neighborhood had seen what the HOA was doing. They had gone too far, and everyone knew it. My neighbors started sharing their own horror stories, years of unfair fines, threats, and harassment. One family had been fined for excessive noise because their toddler laughed too loud in the backyard. Another had been forced to tear down a perfectly legal shed because the HOA suddenly changed their guidelines without notice. The neighborhood was done being afraid. I contacted a lawyer, one who specialized in HOA abuse cases. We compiled every single instance of harassment, every false fine, every shady financial transaction they had made. And then, we took them to court. And let me tell you, nothing was more satisfying than watching their smug faces crumble when the judge saw just how corrupt they really were. Because once the legal system got involved, it was over for them. The lien, thrown out. The fines, dismissed. The bogus violations, null and void. And the best part? The judge ordered a full financial audit of the HOA. Turns out, the fines they had imposed on homeowners over the years? Illegal. The money they had been collecting? Mismanaged. The board members? Liable for fraud. One by one, the HOA members resigned in disgrace. The entire board was dismantled. And the HOA? It was dissolved completely. No more ridiculous rules. No more petty fines. No more power-hungry HOA dictators. And as for me, I kept my home, my driveway, my fence, my property, all mine, just as it always should have been. The HOA thought they could break me, that with enough harassment, enough fines, enough legal threats, I would fold, give up, sell my house, and leave, like so many other homeowners had before me. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't like the others. I wasn't scared of their empty threats. And if they wanted to play dirty, I was ready to play smarter.
By this point, my battle with the HOA had reached a boiling point. They had thrown everything they had at me: bogus violations, fines that piled up week after week, even a lien on my property. And now, they were making their final move. A foreclosure notice. They were actually trying to take my home. I remember staring at that notice, feeling a mix of rage and disbelief. It didn't matter that the fines were fraudulent. It didn't matter that I had proof of their corruption. They had gotten away with this for years, intimidating homeowners with legal jargon, manipulating the system to their advantage. But the thing about bullies, they never expect you to fight back. So I did what they never saw coming. I exposed them. I gathered everything, every notice, every letter, every ridiculous violation they had ever slapped me with. I put together a timeline of their harassment, a paper trail that painted a very clear picture, one of corruption, greed, and outright abuse of power. Then, I went public. I reached out to local news stations, sharing my story. I posted everything online, warning other homeowners about what the HOA was doing. And the response? It exploded. Other homeowners, dozens of them, came forward with their own horror stories. People who had been fined for having the wrong shade of grass. Families who had been forced to remove harmless decorations because they weren't aesthetically pleasing. One elderly couple who had nearly lost their home over a $200 fee. And just like that, the HOA's dirty laundry was out in the open. The media ran with it. News channels started digging into the HOA's finances, questioning how fines were being used. Turns out, a lot of that money wasn't going where it was supposed to. In fact, some of it had mysteriously disappeared. The HOA board tried to do damage control. They sent out desperate letters trying to silence homeowners, telling us not to speak to reporters. They even threatened legal action against me for defamation. But it was too late, because while they were busy panicking, I was one step ahead. I had already spoken to a lawyer, and not just any lawyer, one who specialized in HOA abuse cases. He took one look at the evidence I had gathered and said, "You've got them." And he was right. We took them to court, and when all their shady dealings were brought to light, the judge destroyed them. The fines? Dismissed. The foreclosure attempt? Blocked. The lien? Wiped away. And the best part? The judge ordered a full audit of the HOA's finances. That's when things really fell apart for them. Turns out, several board members had been pocketing money. Thousands of dollars in fees had been mysteriously unaccounted for. And that little stunt where they tried to steal my house? It violated state laws. The HOA board was forced to resign. And as for the fines they had unlawfully imposed on homeowners over the years, they had to pay them all back. Homeowners who had been bullied into selling, they sued. Families who had been unfairly targeted, they got justice. And me? I got the last laugh. Because not only did I keep my home, but the HOA, the same corrupt organization that had tried to ruin me, was completely dismantled. No more ridiculous rules. No more power-hungry board members. No more HOA dictatorship. And as I stood in my driveway, watching the final board members pack up their offices in disgrace, I couldn't help but smile. They had tried to bully me, but in the end, I won. If there was one thing the HOA hated more than anything, it was losing control. They thrived on power, on making homeowners feel small and helpless, on enforcing ridiculous rules just because they could. But on this particular day, the day they thought they had completely defeated me, was the day they realized they had picked the wrong person to mess with. It started with yet another letter. This time, it wasn't just a fine or a violation notice. It was a final warning. They were claiming I had refused to comply with their rules and that my house was officially being taken for auction. They were serious. They thought they could legally take my home, sell it out from under me, and use the money however they pleased. I stood in my kitchen, gripping that letter so hard my fingers crumpled the edges. My blood was boiling. After everything they had pulled, blocking my driveway, sending ridiculous fines, trying to intimidate me into leaving, this was their final move. They thought they had won. They had no idea I was about to destroy them. The thing about bullies is, they get so comfortable pushing people around that they never stop to think, what if this person fights back? And that was their biggest mistake. Because while they had been scheming and plotting behind closed doors, I had been preparing. For weeks, I had been gathering evidence. I had been documenting everything. I had spoken to other homeowners, many of whom had been victims of the same harassment. I had contacted legal professionals, people who specialized in fighting back against corrupt HOAs. I had done my homework. And now, it was time to unleash everything. I walked into their next board meeting like I owned the place. The room was packed. Homeowners who had grown sick of the HOA's nonsense, board members who thought they were untouchable, and a few unsuspecting people who had no idea a storm was coming. I started simple. I pulled out their own documents, copies of fines, violation notices, warnings, and legal threats, not just against me, but against dozens of homeowners. I made sure everyone in that room saw just how ridiculous some of these rules were. Charging a single mother $500 because her kid's bike was left outside for 10 minutes? Fining an elderly man because his grass wasn't the right shade of green? Threatening a disabled veteran with eviction because his wheelchair ramp didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic? The room grew tense. People started muttering, shaking their heads, whispering to each other. The board members shifted in their seats, but they were still smug. They still thought they were safe. That's when I dropped the real bombshell. I had proof, solid proof, that the HOA had been misusing funds. A full breakdown of where the homeowner's money was actually going. Turns out, while they were claiming that every fine and fee was being used for neighborhood improvements, the truth was much darker. Thousands of dollars were missing. Money had been redirected into personal accounts. HOA board members had been using community funds for their own expenses. Homeowners lost it. People were standing, demanding answers, shouting over each other. Some were pulling out their phones, recording the chaos. One woman yelled, "You tried to take my house while you were stealing our money?" The board members? Panic. Full on, deer in the headlights panic. Their smug expressions vanished as they realized they weren't in control anymore. And then, the final blow. I had a lawyer with me. Not just any lawyer. One who specialized in HOA fraud cases. She stood up and, in the calmest voice possible, informed the board that we were taking legal action. Not just me, all of us. A full-blown lawsuit. The room erupted. The HOA had spent years bullying homeowners, fining them for nonsense, threatening them into silence, stealing from them. But now they were the ones being dragged into court. The next few weeks were a disaster for them. The investigation into the HOA's finances uncovered even more corruption. News outlets picked up the story. Board members started resigning left and right, trying to jump ship before things got worse. But it was too late. In the end, the HOA was completely dismantled. The stolen money had to be paid back. The board members responsible faced serious legal consequences. And all those ridiculous fines they had forced on homeowners wiped away. And me? I stood in my front yard, watching as the last remnants of their pathetic reign crumbled to dust. My home was mine. My neighbors were finally free. And the HOA, they had no power left. They had spent years abusing their authority. But in the end, their ego got crushed. The HOA had done a lot of outrageous, power-hungry things since I moved into this neighborhood, but this was by far the pettiest, most ridiculous stunt they had pulled. And the irony? It was the one thing that completely destroyed them. At this point, they had already been humiliated. Their reputation was in shambles. The lawsuit was well underway. Homeowners had turned against them, and the entire neighborhood knew they had been stealing money, abusing power, and making up rules just to control people. They should have known they were fighting a losing battle. But no. Instead of backing down, instead of taking the hint that they were finished, they decided to go out swinging. And by swinging, I mean they made one last desperate attempt to make my life miserable. Their plan? A trash can violation. Yes, you heard that right. A freaking trash can. One morning, I walked outside to get the mail and found yet another HOA violation notice taped to my door. At first, I rolled my eyes, assuming it was just another bogus fine. But when I looked closer, I couldn't help but laugh. The violation? Trash can placement in non-compliance with HOA standards. Seriously? They were accusing me of putting my trash cans out too early. According to their rules, bins were only allowed on the curb after 7 p.m. the night before pickup and had to be brought back in by 9 a.m. the next morning. And guess what? They had evidence. Attached to the notice was a blurry, low-quality photo of my trash can sitting by the curb at 6:58 p.m. Yes, 2 minutes early. They fined me $500 for 2 minutes. I stood there, staring at the paper, and just burst out laughing. It was so pathetic, so desperate, that I couldn't even be mad. I knew exactly what this was. They weren't trying to enforce rules. They were trying to get back at me. But what they didn't realize was that they had just handed me exactly what I needed to finish them off for good. See, the HOA had a pattern. Every time they sent a fine, they claimed it was fair and consistent. They insisted that all homeowners were treated equally under their rules. But I knew that was a lie. So I started digging. I went around the neighborhood, talking to people. I asked if anyone else had ever been fined for trash can violations. Most of them said no. Some admitted they left their cans out way longer than I ever did and had never heard a word from the HOA. And then I found the golden ticket. A neighbor, let's call her Linda, had security camera footage of her trash can sitting out for over 24 hours. It was still sitting there as we spoke. No violation, no fine, nothing. That's when I knew I had them. I compiled everything. I put together photos, security footage, timestamps, witness statements, solid proof that the HOA was targeting me specifically while ignoring other homeowners who actually broke the rules. Then, I took it straight to my lawyer. What happened next was glorious. See, there's a little thing called the Fair Housing Act. It's a federal law that protects homeowners from discriminatory practices. And guess what? Selective enforcement, aka fining one person for a rule while letting others slide, is a huge violation. My lawyer was thrilled. She told me this was the final nail in the HOA's coffin. We took the case to court. And when the judge saw just how petty and ridiculous the HOA had been, they didn't just toss out my fine. They ruled that the HOA had engaged in unlawful discrimination. And the punishment? Devastating. The HOA was ordered to refund every single fine they had issued unfairly. They had to pay damages to every homeowner they had wrongfully targeted. And to top it all off, the judge ordered a full audit of their finances. It was a disaster for them. The audit uncovered even more corruption. Missing funds, illegal expenses, fake invoices, all of it. The board members panicked. They started pointing fingers at each other, trying to shift the blame. But it didn't matter. They had spent years terrorizing homeowners. Now, they were the ones getting destroyed. Within weeks, the entire HOA collapsed. The remaining board members resigned in disgrace. The homeowners voted to dissolve the HOA completely. And just like that, the tyranny was over. The best part? I still have that stupid violation notice framed in my house. It's a reminder that sometimes the pettiest moves lead to the biggest downfalls. And my HOA? They learned that lesson the hard way. I thought I had seen it all. Ridiculous fines, absurd rules, power-hungry board members throwing tantrums. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. The HOA had already been exposed for their shady behavior. Their reputation was hanging by a thread. Homeowners were turning against them. The lawsuit was moving forward, and they were bleeding money from all the fines they were being forced to refund. Any reasonable group would have cut their losses and backed off. But not my HOA. Instead, they decided to make one last, desperate move. And it turned out to be the dumbest decision they had ever made. One evening, I was enjoying a quiet night when I got a knock on my door. It was one of my neighbors, looking furious. "You're not going to believe this," she said, handing me a letter. I opened it, and my jaw dropped. The HOA had sent out a new rule, one specifically targeting me. According to the letter, the HOA had decided to ban public complaints about board members. Any homeowner caught spreading negativity about the HOA would be fined and, if necessary, sued for defamation. They were literally trying to silence us. And here's the kicker. The rule only applied to me. They had worded it in a way that clearly meant I was the target. The board was so butthurt over getting exposed that they were willing to rewrite their own rules just to shut me up. Oh, but they had no idea what they had just done. I looked at my neighbor and smiled. They just made a huge mistake. See, there's this little thing called freedom of speech. And legally speaking, an HOA cannot take away a homeowner's right to talk about real, factual events. But this wasn't just a bad rule. It was an illegal one. So, I did what I do best. I documented everything. I took a photo of the letter, gathered every piece of evidence I had on them, and made a few phone calls. Within 48 hours, my lawyer was on it. We drafted a cease and desist letter so airtight that it made it clear. If they didn't immediately revoke their nonsense rule, they would be facing a massive lawsuit for violating homeowner rights. But I wasn't done yet. I took it to the homeowners. I went door to door showing people exactly what the HOA was trying to pull. The response? Pure outrage. People were furious. The very next week, we held an emergency homeowner meeting. And this time, the HOA couldn't weasel out of it. The board members showed up, looking smug, until they saw how many people were there. I stood up, held the letter high, and said, "This is what they think of us. They think they can take away our voices. They think they can bully us into silence. I say, no more." The room erupted into applause. The HOA president tried to talk his way out of it. It's just a precaution to protect the integrity of the HOA, but he was drowned out by angry homeowners demanding answers. One person stood up and shouted, "We're done with you!" Another yelled, "You're ruining our community!" And then, the best part, a motion to remove the board. By the time the meeting ended, the vote was unanimous. The entire HOA board was kicked out, and that wasn't even the worst part for them. See, the former board members thought they could just walk away, but with everything they had done, the shady fees, the misused funds, the violations, we made sure they were held accountable. Multiple lawsuits were filed. Some of them even had to pay out of pocket for their wrongdoings. And the best part? Without their petty rules, ridiculous fines, and constant harassment, our community thrived. The homeowners worked together, fixed things without unnecessary restrictions, and made the neighborhood better than ever. As for the former HOA president, let's just say he won't be running a neighborhood ever again. And that's how their dumbest decision led to their ultimate downfall. If you've ever dealt with a nightmare HOA, entitled board members, or ridiculous rules, you know how frustrating it is. They think they can control everything, but when people fight back, the power shifts. This story isn't just about me. It's about every homeowner who's ever been targeted, bullied, or pushed around by an HOA that forgot one simple truth. The homeowners have the real power. If you love stories about standing up against injustice, exposing power-hungry tyrants, and getting the ultimate revenge, then make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I've got more wild HOA stories, insane neighborhood battles, and shocking homeowner wins coming up. You won't want to miss them. And if you've got your own HOA horror story, drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear how you fought back. Now go enjoy your HOA free day.